Oh, hell, Internet! This is the summary for What is Freedom by Hannah Arendt, one of the more subtle essays in between past and future, but that does leave it vulnerable to criticisms of vagueness. Remember, I am not an expert, so constructive comments and questions below. This essay explores several interpretations of freedom through time, traditional models of how freedom is expressed, and it tries to give each stage its due in forming a theory. The core distinction is between the inner will, or free will, and the outer ability to act, or political freedom. And this is part one, the paradox of freedom. The paradox is also seen in the fact that the more we investigate the world in a scientific way, the less absolute freedom we in fact seem to have, which leads to the problem that, if your action was not free, how can you be held morally responsible for it? One can cop out here with an appeal to intractability, but Kant made the most serious attempt to resolve the problem, claiming that the conflict lies prior to either science or ethics, leading to Kant's need for both theoretical and practical reason, and suggesting that thought itself destroys freedom. Arendt proposes a radically secularizing thesis. It is the contention of the following considerations that the reason for this obscurity is that the phenomenon of freedom does not appear in the realm of thought at all, that neither freedom nor its opposite is experienced in the dialogue between me and myself, and the Western philosophical tradition distorted the very idea of freedom by transposing it from the realm of politics to an inward domain, the will. This transferal happened in the revelations of early Christian thinkers like Paul or Augustine, but also even earlier in Epictetus the Stoic. However, Arendt ultimately disagrees with even Epictetus's most convincing argument for the primacy of inner will, because inner freedom is only ever discovered in response to a loss of political freedom in the world first, which necessitates the retreat into the self. Arendt's apparent definition is that freedom is what makes action and political life coherent in the first place. Our perceived freedom to act and make choices appears self-evident in our everyday lives, so this does seem like an intuitively powerful argument. But on the other hand, we experience freedom, so it must exist, is quite close to God is a perfect being, so he must exist, so it also smells quite a lot like begging the question. One result of this perspective, though, is that political freedom depends on a worldly liberation of some kind, if only from biological necessity, and also a public space in which to demonstrate that freedom. From this, Arendt asserts a deep connectedness of freedom and the political, but she immediately questions this in the light of various totalitarian attempts to subjugate freedom, and she asks, are the critics of government correct to say that politics can only restrict freedom? Spoiler alert, no, they aren't. At all, but only if you accept Arendt's argument. The confusion starts in the 17th century, when protecting the space of remembrance became reinterpreted with the birth of the natural and social sciences. Remembrance was replaced with a concern for the development of the life process as a whole, a phenomenon which fits much better with natural and social sciences in a more complex modern world, but it has little concern for political freedom, being free only in the sense that we speak of a freely flowing stream. But the concept of political freedom did not disappear, and this new focus on the life process only had the effect of accelerating the divergence between modern governments and the populations that they rule. It was not out of a desire for freedom that people eventually demanded their share in government, but out of mistrust in those who held power over their life and goods. And somewhere in all of this, and the Christian takeover of politics that followed the fall of Rome, all people began to accept the idea that internal freedom provided by the vita contemplativa was the true measure of human freedom. But Arendt closes part one by suggesting that, I think the reader may believe he has read only an old truism when I said that the raison d'etre of politics is freedom, and that this freedom is primarily experienced in action. And to explore the tension between these two positions is the purpose of the rest of the essay. Political freedom is freedom of action, which is also an expression of natality, the power to begin something entirely new. Arendt insists that free action is independent of both the will and the intellect, although both will somehow still be necessary, and she does this by appealing to the somewhat Kantian idea of principles. Principles are fundamental ideas, such as honour and love, but also distrust and hatred. As such, these are external to the self, they are not a product of the will, and they are universal to humanity, they are not invented by any one's intellect. This is how Arendt tries to crowbar principles apart from the will and the intellect, and I'm not sure she's entirely successful in this, but then again, maybe I just don't understand Kant well enough yet. Watch this space. The claim, though, is that free action manifests a principle, and that this freedom exists only as long as this principled action lasts, and no longer. Confusingly, though, she says that freedom or its opposite can appear where principles are actualized. How can this be, though? Maybe principles of oppression and control manifest freedom's opposite. But who knows, because she doesn't actually elaborate. And in any case, surely to act to oppress can still be a free action of the oppressor. I am far from sold on Arendt's characterization of principles here, although, of course, it does depend if I have understood it correctly. The good news, though, is that she follows up this rather muddy definition with a superb metaphor from Machiavelli. Virtù is the ability to act spontaneously and appropriately to worldly circumstances, or fortuna. Arendt transfers Machiavelli's meaning to the arts, and in the process she clarifies how politics is supposed to stand apart from the craft analogies of Plato. The expression of virtù can be compared to the virtuosity of the performer, and this can only occur in the performing arts, rather than the more craft-based creative arts. The virtuoso shows superlative skill in the performance itself. The spontaneity and effortlessness transcend any will or intellect. Only pure, free action remains. The audience witness this expression of freedom by witnessing the performance. By contrast, the painter or the sculptor, etc., may express freedom in their work, but this freedom will never be seen by the audience, who can observe only the static and completed work. Arendt claims that although politics is often defined as an art, this is in fact just a metaphor, and it is completely inappropriate to go on to then say that the state is therefore a work of art. This was Plato's error, echoed in much of subsequent political thought, up to and including Marx. The state is a performance, and it depends entirely on the continued action of people, or else it will simply cease to be. Before we move on, I want to reiterate two key implications of what we have seen so far. First, Marx's mistake that the state can be completed is entirely mirrored in the conservative error that the state was perfect at some time in the past and requires no further changes. Both of these errors go all the way back to Plato. The second thing to reiterate is that the ability to appear before others in a performance of plurality is the link between freedom and politics, and not the naive idea that plurality simply gives someone else to be free from. The state and the political realm therefore provided space for these performances, and the Greek polis was a good place to start because this was politics' honeymoon period, where there was a sense of optimism still that political action could truly bring harmony to the human world. I will mention only in passing Arendt's decision to reject any political sphere in the so-called barbarian empires. This can be argued another time. But the subsequent shift towards inner freedom is less Greco-Roman than it is Socratic and Augustinian, as it was these two who truly initiated the domination of the vita contemplativa over political life. This was made worse by classical liberals such as Mill, who maintained that perfect liberty is in tension with society, and that while thought is not inherently dangerous, it can lead to certain actions which do require control by those who have the correct thoughts. This further bolstered the tyranny of the vita contemplativa, and Arendt's metaphor from virtuosity is an attempt to re-establish action as an inherently valuable part of the political process, with the talk of principles perhaps trying to give some philosophical substance to this, although your mileage may vary. But the modern world has fatally undermined philosophical freedom, as the shift towards the life process has reintroduced an element of necessity into politics, which was supposed to exist above all that. Necessity is not traditionally a political issue, but a social and economic one, a realm which Arendt says is growing ever larger in the modern world. This is the source of many of the crises of modernity, and it implies uncomfortable truths for all concerned. In the final paragraph of this section, Arendt, seemingly from nowhere, speaks of courage, and her definition of courage here is essentially a conviction to stand for a political, i.e. worldly position, even against the interests of life itself, i.e. the social and economic sphere. Or, as Arendt puts it, courage is indispensable because in politics, not life, but the world is at stake. Part 3 focuses on will and how free will conflicts with many of our more intuitive ideas around political freedom. These subjects are quite nuanced, and as ever, I do not claim philosophical rigour or expertise. Be advised. The basic problem, though, is that philosophical and religious freedom developed quite apart from any prior concepts of political freedom, and they are not suited to political treatment at all. Socrates and Augustine focused on the intellect and the will for their various philosophical projects, created the conditions for Plato and Christianity to then assimilate them into their respective political projects, and when the latter finally received political power, the domination of the vita contemplativa became institutionalized. This was the great tragedy of early philosophy, but its great irony was that this domination has since become the basis of both the religious and scientific traditions in which the vitality of human action is subjugated to the demands of the will and the intellect. For the purposes of this summary, we shall skip much of the nuance and say that Plato, along with many of the ancients, did not conceive of the will at all, but knew only the inner dialectic, which is the existential precondition of thought, but is not the same as an internal monologue. When Augustine came to reflect upon the will, he found that while the inner dialectic enables thought, it paralyzes the will because it is a necessary aspect of the will that it wills against something, a will not. And so the will is revealed to be broken in itself. Or, as Arendt puts it, Christian willpower was discovered as an organ of self-liberation and immediately found wanting. On the other hand, the ancients did not recognize this conflict. Indeed, Plato's conception of self-control, in which the soul rules over the body, is what made a person suitable for political power in the first place. Self-control has remained one of the specifically political virtues, if only because it is an outstanding phenomenon of virtuosity where I will and I can must be so well attuned that they practically coincide. She even says later that only where the I will and I can coincide does freedom come to pass, all of which seems to be supporting Plato's assertions of the dominance of the vita contemplativa. However, this conclusion is complicated by necessity. Augustine claimed that necessity can confound both the I will and the I know, which is the intellect, and Arendt claims that 17th century thinkers like Montesquieu made the case against the likes of Hobbes that political freedom was blocked by both external and internal constraints. If your I can is negated, then the source of the negation is irrelevant, so there is no special priority of the will and thus the vita contemplativa against action, and Arendt is adamant. I can only hint here at the fatal consequences for political theory of this equation of freedom with the human capacity to will. It is one of the causes why, even today, we almost automatically equate power with oppression, or at least with rule over others. To Arendt, this is a fundamental misconception in the very foundations of Western political thought. So, no biggie or anything. Add to this that the distinction between the will and the intellect seems to be that the will is inherently concerned with the self, whereas the intellect is inherently concerned with not the self. And so we have another example of those fatal consequences. Tyranny, the only form of government which arises directly out of the I will, owes its greedy cruelty to an egotism utterly absent from the utopian tyrannies of reason with which the philosophers wished to coerce men and which they conceived on the model of the I think. Plato's authoritarianism, then, was intended to be a product of the intellect, not the will, and the conflation of free will with political freedom led to the will to power, although Arendt does not mention Nietzsche here. The final result of this is that the expression of freedom became not virtuosity, but sovereignty of the will, and thus it does not uphold Plato's utopian ideal. Without the clear and obvious effect of virtuosity, sovereignty is just another control system. No matter what the sovereign is, it cannot be the source of freedom. Arendt also rejects Rousseau's account of sovereignty, because she says it would be absurd for the will to bind itself to any future action, and the foundation of politics is to make promises, which are just such bindings towards future action. As Arendt puts it, a community founded upon this sovereign will would be built not on sand, but on quicksand. The TLDR for section 3 is that because the will is a kind of dictator, and a schizophrenic one at that, it cannot be permitted any say in matters of freedom. If men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty they must renounce. And so, in the wake of the destructive outcomes of basing freedom on the will, the source of a potential rejuvenation is, all together now, ancient Greece and Rome. The elegant simplicity of Greco-Roman political thought reflects the optimistic tone towards politics we spoke of earlier. However, we should not therefore assume that politics of a simpler polity are therefore suitable for the more complex modern world. Unfortunately, what exactly is going on in early politics is deeply embedded in layers of Socratic noise, and so Arendt focuses on two verbs that mean to act. In Greek, the words are archein and pratein. In Latin, the words are agere and gerere. In each pair, the former word roughly means to begin or to set something in motion, while the latter word means to carry something through, to complete or support that which is begun. Archein is perhaps the closest that the Greeks came to philosophical freedom, and it touches on Arendt's own conception of natality. It is ironic then that political freedom is found, says Arendt at least, in the work of Augustine, although she does cherry-pick a single chapter, Book 12, Chapter 20 of The City of God. Here, Augustine details his belief that no soul, once saved, ever returns to the pain of mortal existence, or else what is even the point of redemption at all? Arendt takes this as the first appearance of any kind of freedom in the history of philosophy, the strict uniqueness of each and every life. If I understand her correctly, she reinterprets Augustine so that it is not a beginning, a foundation that gives freedom, but rather an ongoing process of natality. To support this interpretation, Arendt goes to a surprising source. Yet I am convinced this impression would change considerably if the sayings of Jesus of Nazareth were taken more seriously in their philosophic implications. On the one hand, there is no doubt that Jesus of Nazareth is a central figure in the history of Western religious thinking, and therefore integral to Western political thinking. But on the other hand, he's all over the place. Arendt is, I would suggest, using the image of Jesus as a compassionate human over and above his traditional place as the Son of God, with all of the political baggage that has followed over the centuries. It's a brave idea, I will say. The claim is that freedom in the Gospels is the earthly purpose of faith, and that the purpose of faith is to witness miracles. The word miracle has several meanings in the context of Scripture, but Arendt simplifies the matter by restricting herself to cases that are not supernatural, but are rather only what all miracles, whether mundane or supernatural, always must be, which is interruptions of some natural series of events, of some automatic process, in whose context they constitute the wholly unexpected. This is indeed a clever redefining of the word miracle, and it will not be acceptable to everyone, but automatism as a constraint is crucial here. Automatism is not free by definition, whether the compulsion is that of circumstance, political coercion, or internal factors like emotions. Every earthly action, bar none, can lead to a dangerously automatic process, and, in a line which must be intentionally provocative, she says, automatism is why no single act can ever, once and for all, save a man or a nation or mankind. Period. End of story. Automatism exists in the inescapable natural process from birth towards death, the continuing cycle of biological necessity, which, as vital as it may be, in both senses of the word, is something that humans have constantly tried to transcend throughout our cultural history. Into any automatic process, unexpectedness interrupts what would otherwise be a simple mechanism, and that is a miracle. Arendt says that this same process plays out in the political arena. As cultures and governments become ossified, that is, automated, the capacity to begin something new, the hallmark of human freedom, always remains intact. For this reason, freedom can become mistaken for an essentially non-political phenomenon, but it is not, because those actions taken in the service of political reconstruction and reordering are also political, as long as there remains any kind of human world or culture at all. As someone who is on the political left, I am always happy to point out the degree to which modern conservatives' hatred of the state is self-defeating, unless by conservative you think we should still be living in literal caves. But this problem cuts both ways. Those who think of themselves as liberal or even progressive, whatever the hell that means, also claim that their ideas are based on pure reason, often lifting up science as the ultimate representative of reason. In the end then, liberal and conservative alike start from the most fundamental maxim of the Socratic school. The vita contemplativa is to be held above all, and the vita activa is to be suppressed in every case. And once you have chosen your perfect ideology, all that is left is to automatically follow its dictates. A tyranny of reason, if you will. Now I will go to bat for science here. Proper scientific method, applied rigorously, will always change its approach and conclusions in the light of new information, and it is constantly looking for inconsistencies in the systems that do exist. But the problem is that discoveries are always applied to the world in ways that are not strictly scientific, but their grounding in reason is nonetheless given as evidence that they must be sacrosanct, to say nothing of the fact that the way science is funded is, shall we call it inefficient? We have seen automism as a politically destructive force then, and unexpectedness as the miraculous counter to it. But how does this help us make sense of everyday freedom? In fact, Arendt says that the priority goes in the other direction. Every act, seen from the perspective not of the agent, but of the process in whose framework it occurs and whose automatism it interrupts, is a miracle. That is, something which could not be expected. Contingency ensures that every action that takes place does so at the end of a chain of actions which, strictly speaking, have a probability that is infinitesimal and may thus be called miraculous. Our ability to make sense of the contingent world is our narrative-forming capacity, and, says Arendt, it is only due to this very everyday and normal faculty that the more familiar miracles, whether that be great human achievements or literal supernatural events, can be contextualized at all. From here, it is a couple of paragraphs to the end. In the full deep dive, I read these out in full, which with hindsight is a little indulgent, but it was in keeping with the rest of the series. Once you get to 100 minutes, what's one more, eh? The conclusion, though, elaborates the power of contingency to reveal freedom. In a history where actions are being taken all the time, we can expect miracles to happen. Furthermore, the greater the impending disaster, the more miraculous any rescue will appear, because it is disaster, not salvation, that happens automatically, and so might appear to be irresistible. Which is a rather dubious claim, but hey, we are swept up in the moment here. Finally, she says that the decisive difference between the infinite improbabilities of nature and those of history is the simple fact that it is people who are acting, and through action are able to establish a reality of their own. Remember, she said this at a time where these words could still sound idealistic because post-truth politics had not developed to a point where people are in fact making realities of their own. Although, to be fair, this postmodern version is about internally or maybe psychologically invented realities, so Arendt could claim that this is the spectre of the vita contemplativa once again. So I don't want to labour this too much with an outro. Suffice to say that Arendt's concept of freedom is unquestionably in tension with many of the orthodox philosophical and political positions, and she is literally trying to rearrange, if not entirely remove, the foundations of Western political thought. To agree with her, you would have to both follow and clearly understand the narrative case that she is making. I hope that I have done both, but that does seem rather doubtful. Let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and bye for now.